Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived exactly where a person like Mrs. Rachel Lynde ought to live, beside the main road through Avonlea, where she could see nearly everyone who passed. The road dipped into a hollow near her house, crossed a brook, and climbed toward a wooded hill. Anyone leaving Avonlea or entering it was almost certain to pass beneath Mrs. Lynde's watchful window. And Mrs. Lynde did watch. She was an excellent housekeeper, an active member of the church, and a tireless worker for every charitable cause in the district. Yet no duty was so demanding that she could not also keep track of her neighbors. She knew who was ill, who was visiting whom, who had bought a new cow, and which family had quarreled over a fence. If something happened in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel usually knew about it before the people most concerned had decided what it meant. One warm June afternoon, she sat at her kitchen window, knitting a cotton quilt. Beyond the yard, the brook hurried past under the alders, bright and noisy after the spring rains. Everything seemed ordinary. Then Matthew Cuthbert drove by. Mrs. Rachel stopped knitting. Matthew rarely left Green Gables unless there was a clear reason. He was painfully shy, especially around women, and disliked any errand that required conversation. Yet here he was, dressed in his best dark suit and white collar, driving beyond the village at 3:30 in the afternoon. Mrs. Rachel leaned closer to the window. The fields were not ready for planting. It was too early for a doctor's visit and too late for church. Matthew was not going to Bright River to collect supplies, because he had already done that the previous evening. There could be only one solution. She must go to Green Gables and ask Marilla. An hour later, Mrs. Rachel was walking briskly up the long lane that led to the Cuthbert farm. Green Gables stood back from the road, surrounded by orchards and tall trees. Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert had lived there all their lives. Neither had married. Matthew was nearly 60, quiet and gentle. Marilla was several years younger, tall, angular, and known for speaking plainly. Mrs. Rachel found her sitting by the kitchen window, knitting. "Good afternoon, Marilla," she said. "I saw Matthew driving toward Bright River. He looked as though he were going somewhere important." Marilla did not seem surprised by the question. "He has gone to the station." "At this time of day?" "Yes." Mrs. Rachel waited. Marilla continued knitting. At last, Mrs. Rachel asked, "And what is he going to the station for?" "To meet a boy." Mrs. Rachel's knitting fell into her lap. "A boy?" "Matthew and I have decided to adopt one." For once, Rachel Lynde had no immediate reply. Marilla explained that Mrs. Spencer, who lived near the railway, was traveling to an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia. She had agreed to bring back a boy of about 10 or 11, old enough to help Matthew with the lighter farm work, but young enough to be raised properly. Mrs. Rachel stared at her. "Marilla Cuthbert, are you telling me that you intend to bring a strange orphan into this house without knowing anything about him?" "We know he comes from the asylum." "That is exactly what worries me." Mrs. Rachel had heard stories. Everyone had heard stories. Orphan children set barns on fire. They poisoned wells. They attacked their guardians while they slept. Marilla's mouth tightened. "I have heard stories about children with parents, too. That does not mean every child is dangerous. But why adopt at all? Matthew is not as strong as he once was. He needs help, and we cannot find a reliable hired boy. We thought we might give a child a home and receive some help in return." Mrs. Rachel shook her head. It was the most astonishing thing she had heard in years. She stayed long enough to explain every possible disaster that might follow. Marilla listened with increasing impatience, but refused to change her mind. At last, Mrs. Rachel rose to leave. "Well, I hope it turns out all right," she said. "But I must say, I think you are taking a terrible risk." After she had gone, Marilla sat for a moment in silence. She did not admit it, even to herself, but some of Rachel's warnings had unsettled her. Still, the arrangements had been made. Somewhere on the evening train, a boy was coming to Green Gables. Chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. Matthew Cuthbert and the sorrel mare traveled the 8 miles to Bright River at an easy pace. It was a beautiful road, passing quiet farmhouses, dark patches of fir trees, and hollows filled with wild plum blossoms. Apple orchards scented the warm air, and the distant meadows faded into pearl and purple mist. Matthew enjoyed the drive in his own quiet way, except whenever he passed a woman and was expected to nod. He was uncomfortable around almost all women except Marilla and Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Little girls made him even more nervous. They usually stared at him from the corners of their eyes, as though they expected him to swallow them if they came too close. When Matthew reached Bright River, the train had already left. The platform was almost deserted. At the far end, a thin little girl sat stiffly upon a pile of shingles. Beside her rested a shabby carpet bag. Matthew barely looked at her. He hurried past and found the station master locking the ticket office. "Will the 5:30 train be here soon?" Matthew asked. "It came and went half an hour ago," the station master replied. "But it left a passenger for you. A little girl. She's sitting down there." Matthew stared at him. "I wasn't expecting a girl. I came for a boy." The station master shrugged. Mrs. Spencer had arrived with the girl, explained that Matthew and his sister were adopting her from an orphan asylum, and continued on to White Sands. "There must be some mistake," Matthew said helplessly. "Well, you'd better ask the girl. She certainly has a tongue of her own." The station master walked away, leaving Matthew to face an ordeal that seemed worse than entering a lion's den. He had to approach a strange girl and somehow ask why she was not a boy. As Matthew slowly crossed the platform, the child rose at once. She was about 11 years old and wore a short, tight dress of ugly yellowish gray cloth. A faded brown sailor hat sat over 2 thick braids of bright red hair. Her face was small, pale, and covered with freckles. Her mouth was wide, and her gray-green eyes seemed far too large for her thin face. But those eyes were alive with expectation. She held out one narrow hand. "I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables?" Matthew nodded. "I'm very glad to see you," she said. "I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming. I imagined all sorts of things that might have happened to you." Matthew awkwardly shook her hand. "I decided that if you didn't come tonight, I would walk down the railway track and climb into that wild cherry tree by the bend. I could sleep among the blossoms. It would be cold, of course, but very romantic. In the moonlight, I could imagine I was sleeping in a marble palace." Matthew looked toward the white-blossomed tree. He could not tell this child, with her shining eyes, that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla explain. "I'm sorry I was late," he said. "Come along. The horse is waiting across the road. Give me your bag." "Oh, I had better carry it," the girl said. "It isn't heavy, even though it contains all my worldly possessions. The handle comes loose unless you hold it in exactly the right way." She walked beside him, speaking without pause. "I'm very glad you came. although it might have been lovely to sleep in the cherry tree. Mrs. Spencer said Green Gables is 8 miles away. I'm glad it's a long drive because I love riding in a buggy. Matthew lifted the carpet bag into the carriage and helped her climb in. It seems wonderful to think I'm going to live with you, she continued. I've never really belonged to anyone before. The asylum was the worst place I've lived, although I suppose the people there meant well. She looked troubled for a moment. Mrs. Spencer said it was wicked of me to say that. But it is very easy to be wicked without meaning to be, isn't it? Matthew had no answer ready. There wasn't much room for imagination at the asylum, she continued. Only the other orphans. I sometimes imagined the girl beside me was really the daughter of a nobleman who had been stolen as a baby. It made things more interesting. They climbed into the buggy and left the village behind. For a few moments, the girl was silent, either because she was out of breath or because she was busy looking at everything around her. Then a flowering branch brushed against the buggy. She reached out and touched it. Isn't that beautiful? What does that tree make you think of? Matthew examined it. Well now, I don't know. A bride, of course. A bride in a white dress with a misty veil. She sighed. I've never seen a bride, but I can imagine one. I don't suppose I shall ever be a bride myself. I'm much too homely. But I hope I shall have a beautiful dress someday. She glanced down at her own worn clothing. All the girls at the asylum wore dresses like this. A merchant donated the cloth because he couldn't sell it. Or perhaps it was out of kindness. I prefer to imagine it was kindness. She smiled again. When I traveled here, I pretended I was wearing a pale blue silk dress with a flowered hat. When you're imagining something, you may as well imagine something worthwhile. Matthew stole a glance at her. He had never heard anyone speak so quickly or move from unhappiness to delight with such ease. I already love Prince Edward Island, she continued. The blossoms, the trees, and even those strange red roads. Why are the roads red? Well now, I don't know. That is something I shall have to discover. Isn't it splendid that there are so many things left to discover? The world would be much less interesting if we knew everything. She paused and looked at him anxiously. Am I talking too much? People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I stopped? Matthew surprised himself by realizing that he did not want her to stop. Most talkative people expected others to answer them. But this child seemed perfectly willing to do all the talking herself. No, he said shyly. You can talk as much as you like. I don't mind. Her whole face brightened. Oh, I'm so glad. I knew we were going to understand each other. It is such a relief to talk when you want to talk and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. She settled more comfortably against the seat. People also laugh because I use big words. But if you have big ideas, you need big words to express them, don't you? Well now, that seems reasonable, Matthew said. Anne looked delighted by his agreement. Mrs. Spencer told me there were trees all around Green Gables. I love trees. There were only a few small ones in front of the asylum, and each one had a white wooden guard around it. Her expression softened. They looked like orphans themselves. I used to talk to them. I told them that if they could grow in a real forest, with moss around their roots and birds in their branches, they would be much happier. Matthew turned his head and looked at her more closely. I felt sorry to leave them this morning, she said. You become attached to things when you've known them a long time. Is there a brook near Green Gables? Yes, there's one below the house. A real brook? Matthew nodded. Anne clasped her hands. I've always dreamed of living near a brook. I never expected that dream to come true. For a moment, she seemed perfectly content. Then she suddenly reached for one of her braids and held it out before Matthew. What color would you call this? Matthew was not used to discussing the shades of a girl's hair, but there was only one possible answer. It's red, isn't it? Anne released the braid with a deep sigh. Yes, it's red. All the brightness went out of her face. That is why I can never be perfectly happy. I can imagine away my freckles and my thinness. I can imagine I have violet eyes and a beautiful complexion. But I can't imagine my red hair away. She stared mournfully ahead. I try to pretend it is black, as dark as a raven's wing, but I always know it is really red. It will probably be my lifelong sorrow. Matthew did not know how to comfort her. I read about a girl who had a lifelong sorrow, Anne continued. Her hair was golden, so naturally, her sorrow was something much more romantic. She looked at Matthew. Would you rather be divinely beautiful, dazzlingly clever, or angelically good? Matthew considered this difficult question. Well now, I don't know. Neither do I. I can never decide. But I don't suppose I shall ever be any of them. Before she could continue, the buggy rounded a curve. Anne suddenly gripped the side of the carriage. Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Matthew turned, alarmed. But nothing was wrong. Before them stretched a long avenue, completely arched by enormous apple trees. Their wide branches met overhead, heavy with white blossoms. Beneath them, the air was cool and filled with a faint purple twilight. At the far end, the setting sun glowed like a rose-colored window in a cathedral. Anne fell completely silent. She leaned back with her thin hands clasped before her, and her face lifted toward the blossoms. Matthew had not believed such a talkative child capable of silence. They passed through the avenue and continued down the road. Dogs barked in the village of Newbridge. Boys shouted, and curious faces appeared at windows. But Anne did not seem to hear them. She remained silent for nearly 3 miles. At last, Matthew wondered whether she was tired. We don't have far to go now, he said. Only another mile. Anne slowly came out of her dream. Oh, Mr. Cuthbert, she whispered. What was that place we passed through? The white place. People call it the Avenue. The Avenue? She looked disappointed. That name doesn't mean anything. Pretty isn't the right word for it, and beautiful isn't enough. It was the first thing I have ever seen that imagination couldn't improve. She placed one hand over her heart. It gave me an ache here, a pleasant ache. Matthew thought carefully. I don't remember ever having one. I do whenever I see something truly beautiful. She looked back toward the road behind them. I shall call it the White Way of Delight. Other people may call it the Avenue, but that will always be its real name to me. Matthew had traveled that road hundreds of times, but he had never imagined it as a cathedral of flowers. Beside Anne, the familiar countryside seemed different. Are we really almost home? Anne asked. Yes. I'm glad, but I'm sorry too. This drive has been so pleasant, and I'm always sorry when pleasant things end. Something even better may come afterward, but you can never be certain. Her voice became softer. Still, I'm glad to be going home. I've never had a real home that I can remember. Matthew shifted uneasily. A moment later, they reached the crest of a hill. Below them lay a long pond, shining beneath the fading sunset. Pink, gold, green, and violet light moved across the water. Dark firs and maples leaned over its banks, and wild plum trees stood beside it like girls dressed in white. Anne drew in a long breath. What is that place called? Barry's Pond. Her face fell. Oh, that doesn't suit it at all. She studied the changing colors on the water. I shall call it the Lake of Shining Waters. Yes, that is exactly right. Matthew almost smiled. Who lives in that house? She asked, pointing to a gray home beyond the pond. Mr. Barry and his family. The place is called Orchard Slope. Does he have any daughters? He has one about your age. Her name is Diana. Diana! Anne spoke the name as if it were music. What a beautiful name. Do you think she might like me? I expect she might. I have always wanted a bosom friend, Anne said. Someone who understands you completely and loves you no matter what. Matthew was not sure what duties a bosom friend might have, so he said nothing. Anne continued talking as they crossed the bridge. She told him, in a lighter voice than the story deserved, about the homes where she had lived before the asylum. Her parents had died when she was a baby. Mrs. Thomas had taken her in, and Anne had helped care for several younger children. After Mr. Thomas was killed, she had been sent to Mrs. Hammond, who had 3 sets of twins and needed help constantly. When Mr. Hammond died, no one had wanted Anne, so she had been sent to the asylum. She explained it all cheerfully, as though it had happened to someone else. Matthew listened with growing discomfort. No child should have learned to speak so lightly about being passed from one home to another. As Anne talked, he began to understand why she created beautiful names, imaginary dresses, and romantic stories. They were not merely games. They were places she had built for herself, when the real world had offered her nowhere to belong. Anne leaned over the side of the buggy and looked back at the pond. Good night, dear Lake of Shining Waters, she said. I always say good night to things I love. I think they like it. The water seemed to smile in the last light. We're nearly home now, Matthew said as they climbed the next hill. Green Gables is over. Oh, don't tell me. Anne caught his raised arm and closed her eyes. Let me find it myself. I'm sure I shall know it. When she opened her eyes, she carefully studied the farms scattered across the valley. The evening light had almost faded. A church spire stood against the golden sky, and the first stars were appearing. Anne's eyes moved from one house to another. Then she saw a white house standing far back from the road, surrounded by dark trees and pale orchard blossoms. Above it shone one clear white star. Her face changed. That is it, isn't it? Matthew smiled in spite of himself. Well now, you guessed it. Mrs. Spencer didn't describe it well enough for me to know, Anne said. But as soon as I saw it, I felt that it was home. She looked at him with shining eyes. I've pinched myself so many times today that my arm must be black and blue. I kept thinking it was all a dream. Then I decided that even if it was a dream, I should keep dreaming as long as possible. She gazed toward the distant house. But it is real. We're nearly home. Anne fell silent again, filled with happiness. Matthew's heart sank. At the station, he had been grateful that Marilla would have to explain the mistake. Now he dreaded the moment. He no longer thought about the inconvenience the girl might cause, or the boy they had expected. He thought only of the light in Anne's eyes, and how quickly it would disappear when she learned that Green Gables was not meant to be her home. The buggy passed through Lynn's Hollow and turned into the long Green Gables lane. The yard was dark, and the poplar leaves rustled softly around them. Matthew lifted Anne down from the buggy. She stood still and listened. "The trees are talking in their sleep," she whispered. "They must be having beautiful dreams." Holding tightly to the carpet bag that contained all her worldly possessions, Anne followed Matthew into the house. Chapter 3. Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. Marilla stood in the doorway when the buggy stopped. The moment she saw Anne, her face changed. "Matthew Cuthbert, who is that?" Matthew climbed down slowly. "It's the child Mrs. Spencer sent." "The child?" Marilla stared at Anne. "Where is the boy?" "There wasn't any boy." Anne looked from Matthew to Marilla. The happiness in her face began to fade. Marilla demanded an explanation, but Matthew had very little to give. The station master had said Mrs. Spencer left the girl for them. That was all he knew. Anne's carpet bag slipped from her hand. "You don't want me," she whispered. Marilla turned toward her. "We were expecting a boy. There has been some mistake." The last of Anne's hope disappeared. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy." Her voice rose with sudden despair. "No one ever does want me. I might have known it was too beautiful to be true." She dropped into a chair and covered her face. "This is the most tragic thing that has ever happened to me." Marilla was uncomfortable with dramatic scenes. "There is no need to cry like that." Anne lifted her wet face. "You would cry too if you were an orphan who had finally reached a beautiful home and then discovered nobody wanted you." Marilla had no answer ready. Anne's grief was extravagant, but it was real. Matthew quietly carried in the carpet bag. Marilla told Anne they would discuss the matter in the morning. For the night, she could stay at Green Gables. Anne did not appear greatly comforted. "May I call you Aunt Marilla?" "No, I am not your aunt." "Could I call you Cordelia?" "Certainly not." Anne sighed. "I have always thought Cordelia was a perfectly elegant name. What is wrong with Anne?" "Nothing, if you spell it with an E." Marilla studied her. "How old are you?" 11 last March. "And where were you born?" Anne's expression changed. She disliked being questioned about facts that offered no room for imagination. But Marilla insisted. Anne told the story of her life more fully. Her parents, Walter and Bertha Shirley, had both been teachers. They died of fever when Anne was 3 months old. No relatives came forward to take her, so Mrs. Thomas carried her home. After that, Anne had gone wherever she was needed. She had rocked babies, washed dishes, watched children, and tried not to cause trouble. She had never attended school regularly, but she loved reading whenever she could find a book. Marilla asked whether the people she had lived with had treated her well. Anne hesitated. "They meant to be good, I think." It was the answer of a child who had learned to protect adults from the truth. Marilla's face softened slightly. Still, practical questions remained. They had asked for a boy, not a girl. Anne could not help Matthew in the way they had intended. Marilla gave Anne bread, butter, and plum preserves. Anne sat at the table but barely ate. "You have no appetite?" Marilla asked. "I can't eat when I'm in the depths of despair." Marilla told her not to use such foolish expressions. Anne explained that imagining oneself in the depths of despair was romantic, but actually being there was uncomfortable. After supper, Marilla took her upstairs. The room beneath the east gable was small and bare, Whitewashed walls, a narrow bed, and a plain washstand were its only furnishings. Yet the window looked out toward the orchard. Anne went to it at once. A large cherry tree stood close to the house, its branches covered in white blossoms. "Oh," she breathed, "there is a tree outside my window." For a moment, grief gave way to wonder. Marilla told her to undress and go to bed. Anne turned from the window. "What is the tree called?" "It doesn't have a name." "Then I shall call her the Snow Queen." Marilla said good night and took the candle. Downstairs, Matthew was waiting. "Well?" he asked. Marilla sat at the table. "She knows nothing about why Mrs. Spencer sent her. It is clearly a mistake." Matthew looked toward the ceiling, as though he could see Anne through it. "She's a real interesting little thing. That has nothing to do with the matter. She might be some company for you." "I am not lonely." Matthew did not argue. He rarely did. After a while, he said, "We might keep her." Marilla stared at him. "Matthew Cuthbert, I believe that child has bewitched you already. She's had a hard life. So have many people. She seems bright. She talks far too much." Matthew considered this. "I rather liked to hear her." Marilla almost smiled, but stopped herself. They had asked for a boy for a practical reason. Keeping Anne would change all their plans. A girl would need care, clothing, discipline, and schooling. Still, Marilla could not forget the way Anne had said that nobody ever wanted her. Tomorrow, she would take Anne to Mrs. Spencer and discover how the mistake had happened. After that, the child would most likely be sent away. Upstairs, Anne lay awake beneath the east gable. Moonlight fell across the floor, and the blossoms of the Snow Queen moved gently beyond the window. Green Gables was more beautiful than any home she had imagined. That made the thought of leaving it almost unbearable.